Are you sometimes wondering if you should say the person who or the person that? Are you unsure when to use whom or whose or which or what? Then join me in this lesson for a complete review of relative pronouns. Hello and welcome everyone. This is Minu at Anglo-Link. Today we're going to review the use of words like whom, who, whose, which, and that when they're used as relative pronouns. A relative pronoun is used after a noun to make it clear which person or thing we're talking about. The information that follows the pronoun is contained in what we call a relative clause. There is often some confusion about which word to use in different situations. Sometimes we want to give information about a person, sometimes about an object. Sometimes it is about something that belongs to the person or the object. So in this lesson, I will clarify the usage of relative pronouns and also explain when you can drop these pronouns. By the end of this lesson, you will have learned how to use these words correctly when you speak and when you write. So when you're ready, we can begin. Relative pronouns. Who, whom, whose, which, that. Let's have a look at where and why we use relative pronouns. We use relative pronouns after a noun. And the reason why we use them is to make it clear which person or thing we're talking about. The part of the sentence that gives the information about the person or the thing is a defining relative clause. For example, the man who lent me the book. The book which I borrowed. The library where we met. Now, let's have a look at which relative pronoun we must use in each case. First of all, for people, we can use who, that, whose, or whom. For example, the man who lent me the book, or the man that lent me the book. The man whose book I borrowed. Be careful with the relative pronoun whom. This pronoun is only common in formal styles. For example, the man from whom I borrowed the book sounds very formal. It becomes less formal if you put the preposition at the end. The man whom I borrowed the book from. However, it's still quite formal. In modern and spoken English, it is best to use who instead and put the preposition at the end. The man who I borrowed the book from. Okay. For objects, we can use which, that, or whose. For example, the book which I borrowed, or the book that I borrowed. The book which is entitled Peace, or the book that is entitled Peace. The book whose title is Peace. Note that you can also say the book the title of which is Peace, or the book of which the title is Peace. In this case, the noun is always preceded by the definite article the. Okay, and finally, for places, times, and reason, you can use where, when, why, or sometimes that. In informal English, you can use these as relative pronouns. However, in formal English, use which with a preposition. For example, the library where we met is informal, and the library at which we met is formal, written English. The day when or that we met. Informal. The day on which we met is formal. The reason why or that I was at the library. That's informal. The reason for which I was at the library is formal. So just note that you can use that instead of when and why, but not instead of where. Right then. A very common question is, can we drop the relative pronoun? In formal written English, it is best not to drop it. However, in informal and spoken English, it is common to drop it, but it is not always possible. So let's have a look at when it is and when it is not possible to drop the relative pronoun. You can drop who, whom, that, and which if the information is related to the object of the sentence, but not when it is related to the subject. For example, the man who or that lent me the book, the man is the subject of the verb lend. Therefore, you cannot drop the relative pronoun. In the sentence, the book which or that is called peace, book is the subject of the verb is. Therefore, you cannot drop the relative pronoun. However, in the clause, the man who or whom I borrowed the book from, the man is the indirect object for the verb borrow. Therefore, you can drop the relative pronoun. The man I borrowed the book from. Also, in the clause, the book which or that I borrowed, the book is the direct object of the verb borrowed. Therefore, you can drop the relative pronoun. The book I borrowed. Just note that you cannot drop whom when it is next to the preposition. The man from whom I borrowed the book. You cannot drop whose, of which, or where. For example, the man whose book I borrowed, the book the title of which is Peace, the library where I met him. You must not drop these relative pronouns. And finally, you can drop when and why in the same way you can drop that. The day when that I met him, the day I met him. The reason why or that I was at the library, the reason I was at the library. So how about what and how? What and how are not relative pronouns because they cannot come after a noun. They replace a noun and a relative pronoun. What means the thing which. What I read in the book surprised me. How means the manner in which. I still remember how we met. So, what is a non-defining relative clause? A non-defining relative clause gives additional information about the person or the thing. If we eliminate this information from the sentence, the listener still knows who or what we're talking about. In written English, there is always a comma before a non-defining relative clause. Let's look at some examples. The man who lent me the book was the author himself, who you may have heard of. If we drop the last part, who you may have heard of, the sentence is still complete. The man who lent me the book was the author himself. Let's look at another example. The book which I borrowed, which you may have read, is entitled Peace. let's drop the non-defining clause, which you may have read, and we'll end up with the book which I borrowed is entitled Peace. The sentence is still complete. A final example. The library where we met, where I always borrow books, is the largest in the city. Let's drop the non-defining relative clause, where I always borrow books, and we have a complete sentence. The library where we met is the largest in the city. Note that you cannot use that instead of who or which in non-defining clauses. For example, the man who or that lent me the book was the author himself, who you may have heard of. You cannot use that instead of who in the final clause. Or, the book which or that I borrowed, which you may have read, is entitled Peace. You must not use that in the non-defining clause. Also, note that sometimes which gives additional information about the whole sentence instead of just the noun in the sentence. For example, the man who lent me the book was the author himself, which was totally amazing. Which relates this information to the whole of the first clause. Right. Let's finish with some exercises. Complete the following sentences with an appropriate word. If the word can be dropped, put it in brackets. For example, I can still remember the day I joined the team. I can still remember the day when or that I joined the team. And you can drop the relative pronoun here, so we've put them in brackets. I can still remember the day I joined the team. Okay, let's begin the exercises. Number 1. Jim is about to get married. No one expected. Jim is about to get married, which no one expected. You cannot drop the relative pronoun. Number 2. These are the people helped me. These are the people who or that helped me. You cannot drop the pronoun. Number 3. Question 10, wording was incorrect, was taken out. Question 10, whose wording was incorrect, was taken out. You cannot drop the relative pronoun. Number 4. This is the gentleman, children I teach. This is the gentleman whose children I teach. You cannot drop whose. Number 5. Is this the house your grandparents used to live? Is this the house where your grandparents used to live? You cannot drop where. Number 6. I have no idea you're talking about. I have no idea what you're talking about. You cannot drop what. Number 7. Is this the colleague you were telling me about? Is this the colleague who or that you were telling me about? You can drop the relative pronoun. Is this the colleague you were telling me about? Number 8. Have you seen the painting they sold for £1 million? Have you seen the painting which or that they sold for £1 million? You can drop the relative pronoun. Have you seen the painting they sold for £1 million? Number 9. We saw many objects. The origins were unknown. We saw many objects, of which the origins were unknown. You cannot drop of which. Number 10. I don't know the reason this has happened. I don't know the reason why or that this has happened. You can drop the relative pronoun. I don't know the reason this has happened. Right then, that's the end of this lesson on relative pronouns. I hope you've enjoyed it. As you know, you can now go to our website, Anglo-Link.com, for more lessons and exercises. Thank you for watching. I look forward to seeing you in my next lesson. Bye now.